Welcome to the GBC Big 3 podcast, a weekly podcast where we sit down and unpack 3 big questions raised from our Sunday sermon. I'm your host, Matt Willis, and joining me as co-host for the Big 3 this week is none other than the delightful Jodine Watling. Jodes, I noticed, just peeking through the church, that you hosted, your own Big 3 kind of thing going on.
I'm breaking away.
You're breaking away. You've got road.
You've got your show now. I need my show.
What was going on? Tell us about it.
Oh, look, we just thought it was a great opportunity to not only have the resources of Hopefield shared to the broader community, especially in a time like this. So it was just a great time to sit down with Robert and Linda, who are 2 of the psychologists that are part of that team, and speak to them on stress and anxiety. And it was really interesting, I think, because we talked about it from a generational perspective, what it means for young people, young adults, elderly, and I think it hits people at different places. So I think to really, pause and to consider what it means for other people not only helps you understand maybe your own stress and anxiety, but also what it means for other people.
Yeah, awesome. And that's on our YouTube channel.
It is.
It is now.
Yes,
There's a little free plug for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not what
on
you know,
YouTube
it's
now.
And joining us after preaching an incredible message on Sunday, isn't it, Mark Rader? And we're actually in your house right now. Ooh, because our church is currently getting some renovations. Random question, but it feels appropriate. When you have guests over and you're cooking, what's your number one dish for people who come over to your house?
Right. Well, I think until currently it would have been these big beef fillets that we get from Costco with kind of crushed potatoes with garlic butter and some sort of vegetable thing.
Yeah.
But more recently, we've got on to chicken shawarma. It's like a Indian with chicken thighs, and it's amazing. Feta, cranberry, roasted almonds, marinated for a couple of days. It's unbelievable.
Delicious.
Yum.
Some might say that it would have been lovely to sit around the table together right
shawarma.
now with some shawarma.
Yeah.
But,
You got to come for dinner then.
yeah, there were no refreshments upon arrival, no canapes. Tropical fruit platter would have been great. Just saying.
We do have a pineapple we're trying to get rid of.
Well, this week, Mark spoke on the anchor of a better promise as part of our series in the book of Hebrews titled Anchor. And you can listen to that message again through our regular GBC Sermons podcast. But today, as always, we'll be unpacking 3 big questions submitted through Slido during our Sunday services. So, Mark, Jodine, let's get into the big 3. Well, Mark, something that you spoke about in your message on Sunday, which I've actually heard you mention a number of times in your sermons, is this idea of lawlessness. We're aware that for the Israelites in the Old Testament and even modern day Jews, that they hold to the law of Moses, that these were instructions given by God to a people around, how to live a life in line with, an active living relationship with God. And then Jesus kind of comes in and flips everything on its head, and we're kind of seemingly released from the law. But that's not necessarily saying that the law is now redundant. And you talk about this idea of lawlessness being that the law is actually so ingrained in who we are that we do it almost without thinking. You used the analogy of, the seatbelt. Like if tomorrow we woke up and no one had to wear seatbelts ever again, majority of us would grab that thing and still clip it in. So I want to unpack that a little bit more in its practicality. What do you think are the cultural barriers that are making it hard for Christians to enter into this idea of a lawless life?
Yeah. I think I think there's 2 things for me. One would be sort of a Christian cultural thing, and one of them would be a kind of a wider cultural thing, but within churches as well. And I think the first is that we tend to have a very negative view of the law as a whole. Like we tend to think about the law as being opposed to grace.
Yeah.
Right. So there's law, and that's bad, and that's when you try to earn your way into heaven. And so we're rid of it. Jesus got rid of it. And then there's grace, which is we don't know what grace is, right? Like it's just this wonderful gift, but we don't have any kind of parameters then in our life. And that grace-filled life can end up becoming anarchic.
Yeah.
Right? Where we just kind of live however we want rather than living the way that we need to live.
Yeah.
And I think so we need to kind of rehabilitate our understanding of the law, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. One is to recognize that the law was meant to kind of describe what a lawless life looked like, right? Like if you were truly internalized, then you would love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and you'd love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
And you would love God in particular ways, and you'd love your neighbor in particular ways, and that would be so deeply ingrained that you wouldn't need the law anymore. So it's a portrait of it. So I think that's one component of it. I think another kind of piece that rehabilitates it for us is to remember that the law was given in the context of relationship.
Yeah.
So I've used the example before about the fact that all relationships have rules, right?
Yeah.
And the deeper and more significant a relationship is, the more significant the rules are. But because the relationship is fulfilling in and of itself, you don't think about the rules as rules.
As rules, yeah.
You don't talk about all the rules I have to follow with my best friends. Like, no, you just kind of understand that you keep confidences and you have their back and you help them out. You just know that stuff.
Yeah.
Right? But I think the other kind of cultural component then is that in lots of areas of life, there is no one agreed upon Christian response. Right?
Yeah.
So take something like drinking alcohol, right? You would find a vast spectrum of views within the Christian church and even within our wider culture about the value of drinking alcohol, right? You would have some who would say that we need to, just don't. You never should. It's an industry that promotes drunkenness and everything that goes with that. Whatever it might be. You'd have other people who would say, hey, listen, we want to be relevant to our society. Jesus made water into wine. Like Timothy was told, take a little bit of wine for your stomach, right? So, and I think that, and the difficulty is, and I've mentioned H. Richard Niebuhr before, and Christ and culture, and there's 5 paradigms of how Christians respond, is that I don't believe that there's ever really one permanent answer.
Yeah.
Right. There are times and places when I think Christians would be better off not drinking. And there are times and places where it's probably not entirely bad for us to have a drink, and kind of everything in between, shall we say. But because there's no one permanent, this is the answer, that makes it really difficult to then even know what part of the law am I internalizing. And that kind of, not gray, but that kind of the nimbleness of faith in our life makes it, I think, difficult to know what am I internalizing. Because if we internalize a certain perspective as the only perspective, if we don't have that flexibility, well, then we become legalistic.
Yeah.
And that's not quite right either, where what we've internalized is a checklist rather than the relationship. So those would be the 2 things that I think are perhaps most complicated for us. And you take that across, same-sex marriage. You got a variety of views.
Absolutely.
You've got stuff wrapped around, how do we engage with entertainment, patterns of spirituality, all that kind of stuff gets played out. And I think that makes it difficult for individual Christians to kind of go, so what am I aiming for here? What am I really trying to do? So.
Yeah. It's interesting, as you were kind of unpacking that for us, it got me thinking about how important cultural discernment is for believers, the ability to look at the world around us and kind of understand the messages and the values and the purposes behind behaviors and ideas that the world kind of pushes onto us. And I think that's something that particularly for young Christians, a lot of young people that I get to spend time with and do life with, they're trying to figure that out. And so that seems to be a really important skill that maybe, we need to be spending some time focusing on.
Well, and we assume that because we live in our culture, we understand our culture, but we don't. We understand how to work in our culture, but we don't necessarily understand the underlying messages. And I can't remember the guy's first name or the name of the book, but his last name is Van Hooser. And he talks about Christian cultural agency. In other words, how do Christians act effectively as Christians in their culture? And he suggests that there needs to be 3 things in that. One is kind of theological competence. You need to know what you believe and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. You need to be able to know what it is to act. Like, you need to be able to act on it. If all you know is some great theology, but you never actually act it out. You missed it.
Yep.
And then you also need cultural competence. You need to be able to engage with your culture in meaningful ways. And if you take one of those three away, it's like the three-legged stool. You end up in all sorts of strife.
Yeah.
You know, if you are theologically competent and you act on it without thinking about your culture, you're going to be irrelevant to lots of people. If you are culturally engaged and you act, but you're not theologically competent, who knows what you're going to end up doing, right? You need all three. And if you're just good at culture and good at theology, but you never act on it, well, you're an author, right?
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
you know, sorry, I probably shouldn't say that, but you know, like it's that kind of dynamic that I think is pretty important for us.
Awesome. I feel like we've just found our next fourth question episode. But so we'll move on from there. Jodes, what are your thoughts coming out of this discussion?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing that question because I think, I guess when you approach these things, you're like, how do I become lawless? How do I become a master of these things?
Yeah.
And I think the more dangerous and vulnerable question is, how do I become heart-centered? Because that is a really vulnerable and it's a hard place to find because you've got to connect with God, you've got to connect with yourself, your culture around.
Yeah.
And how do you maintain, I guess, what you've learnt and understood? It's just hard. And so I hear that question and like, what are the barriers, the cultural barriers? I guess there sometimes can be a sense of what's the big stuff out there with horns and a pitchfork that's going to come at me.
Yeah.
And I think as you grow old, it changes depending on your stage of life. I think of when you're a kid and, you know, your parents are like, don't run out in the road, because you're completely lawless. Like you have all the
anarchy.
That's anarchy. All the gear, no idea. But, you know, that hard love that parents have to give you eventually keeps you off the road, keeps you alive. But as you get older, that changes. You know, you think through your teenagers' lives and peer pressure becomes a thing.
Yeah.
But then I think as you get older, you realise, wow, I can be the biggest barrier to my own growth. My own internal culture, the things that I perceive to be true, whether they're out there cultural narratives or things that I believe of myself or from my family of origin or culture that's around me immediately. So I think it's a hard thing to navigate across your life. And as Mark's saying, there's no right or wrong answer for all ages of all days. Like it just changes and morphs so much. So you get somewhere and then you're like, I've got to work out how to do it all again.
Yeah.
So I guess my question or maybe my thought to add to this is not so much what are the cultural barriers out there to be lawless, but how do we increasingly be on a journey of becoming heart-centered?
Yeah.
And that means us being soft, vulnerable, honest, and open to not only ourselves and God, but the people around us as well.
Yeah, great stuff. And that kind of reminded me about something you just said, Mark, about, you know, when we're in these deep relationships, we don't necessarily see them as rules. They just kind of an overflow of the love that we have. And that, you know, obviously that's the kind of relationship that we're called to have with God. But sometimes we, instead of having that intimacy, that vulnerability, being willing to be raw with God in that space, we kind of go for the checklist instead, which actually leads us into our second question. So let's move into that now. So to bring it back to, I guess, the passage that was unpacked for us on Sunday, you know, once again, this idea is being reinforced of Jesus being better than anything that the world can offer us, that we have new hope from him, you know, we receive a new covenant from him and a restored relationship with God through him. It's, once again, the author of Hebrews is making it clear for the audience that, you know, Jesus is better than anything the world can offer us. And that is true, that is biblical, and that is good. But I guess what stood out for me actually as I heard it and then as I looked on Slido and saw the questions that were being raised was, you know, these things of Jesus being our hope, of Jesus being the fulfillment of promises, they're sentiments that we repeat to ourselves quite regularly. They can almost become our new laws, you know, the new things that we kind of go through in our head. And sometimes they can remain just that, as these sentiments that as Christians, as believers, we know are true. But as we were talking about before, there's a lack of connection and a lack of intimacy and like a deep understanding of what that looks like, and how that actually transforms and changes our lives, which is ultimately where our second question for today kind of lands us. How do I or we as believers ensure in our faith that it is based on a genuine hope of Jesus and not simply Christian sentiment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because in some regards, it's the central question of discipleship, right? How do we make Jesus the Lord of our life? You could, or anything, and you could insert a whole bunch of things into that statement, rather than just a kind of a wonderful little sentiment.
Yeah,
and I think that. Again, something I've said before is that good theology isn't about kind of big words and complex ideas. It's where thinking about God intersects real life. Mm-hmm. And so I think the question ultimately is, so then how do things become real in our lives?
Yes.
And they become real in our lives when they are acted upon and reflected upon. To come back to what Joe just said about parents saying to kids, don't run on the road. And then eventually that gets internalized and you look both ways, because you kind of get the idea that a car can kill you, and you're kind of good on that front, right? And there's a little bit more self-awareness and whatever else happens developmentally. But I think there is something quite powerful about recognizing that we're not going to get from sentiment to deep impact just by wanting it to happen.
Yeah.
There may be a period of time when we need somebody to hold us accountable and kind of go, are you running out on the road again? I'm not sure that analogy works, but follow me on this one, right? Yeah. Because I think that, you almost need to think, okay, so if the sentiment is that I want to become real in my life, that Jesus is my hope, then I think we need to think through, where is my hope concretized in my life? Where does my hope become concrete? And when I hope for something, what do I turn to? Do I turn to myself?
Yeah.
Right? Oh, I hope I can do better this time. Okay, well, that's a place to start thinking, let's work out what it means for me to actually hope in Jesus, to turn to him first.
Yeah.
Do I hope in my friends? Do I hope in the next sermon podcast? Where do I place my hope? Where do I turn when I need hope?
Yeah.
And then training ourselves really to make our hope in Jesus a part of our life. And that's going to take time, and some deliberate action to say, okay, I'm facing a situation. I hope it turns out a particular way. I'm going to pray about it now, or I'm going to reflect on what Jesus's promises are to me about that, or whatever it might be. And so I think we need to train ourselves, and that does require, you think about training, any training regime, the outcome determines what you're going to do. Yeah. Right? Like if you want to get a six pack, you don't do leg day every week, right? You know what I'm saying?
I just don't do exercise.
Yeah, well, I'm with you. I'm making up an analogy that I have no experience with, but you know what I mean, right? If you want a particular outcome, then there are certain exercises that you do. So if we want to have a hope in Jesus, then there are certain things that we probably want to do to help get to that hope, which means we just have to think a little bit more about it and talk to other people. Jodes, what does it mean for you to hope in Jesus? Matt, what does it mean for you to hope in Jesus? And kind of gather some broader wisdom about that, so you have a clear outcome, and then you can kind of work out, well, these are the places in my life where I probably need to work harder at that. And I think that's true in just about any other area of our discipleship.
It's funny that you should say that, because I know definitely in my journey of faith, I came to faith in my mid-teens, and it's interesting because I was far more willing to do a training regime, so to speak, at that time in my life. It seemed normal and natural, and they were very simple things. I was a huge fiend of the WWJD wristband, rocking it each and every day, except when I went to school because it wasn't to dress code. But it's so ridiculous and simple, but having those regular reminders of maintaining that focus. But I've noticed that as I've gotten older, I'm less likely to do that training of self and spirit. And I think I've gotten more a greater expectation of that it will just it should just happen. But that's actually a really unhelpful mindset to be in.
Or we get comfortable.
Yeah.
We get comfortable. We kind of fit in, and so we no longer need to kind of worry about that stuff. And comfort can be pretty dangerous.
Yeah,
not just in
absolutely.
terms of the comfort of luxury, but the comfort of just feeling like, I'm far enough.
Yeah.
So it can be part of it too.
Yeah. Judine, what do you have to throw in on this?
Look, I guess if you're talking about wanting to work out if you've got a genuine hope, welcome to the messy experiment of life. You have to embrace it. You can't make it neat, and you have to fail forward. And I think it actually involves us becoming more observant of who we are and our heart and what is really going on. And that's a really, I think, uncomfortable place for people to be, because it's easier to just go, God is Lord over all, amen, everyone can go home now. Like, or whatever, we can just stick to the narratives, but not actually work out how we're connected in with those. So I guess I go back to the heart-centered walk, because that will soon determine, because if you don't do it now, you're going to pay the bill later. It'll come knocking. So I think, just your example of when you are younger, you kind of just try out everything. You're trying different sports. You're trying to work out on the workbench of life who you are. And those are great experiences. But then you sort of, as you get further down your track, I guess you become a little bit more, not reluctant, but maybe discerning of what you do prefer and what do you like, and how do you, what's the best path for you? That's going to see you realize whatever you're hoping for. So, I'm going back to the heart-centered walk, because I guess it's something you've got to keep on testing and fronting up to your own heart to see how you are really going. And like Mark is saying, where does that theology actually intersect your life and become a practice? So keep practicing those things. And then I guess sitting down and reflecting and auditing, like, okay, what happened? What were the pathways that I was thinking or feeling? What were the outcomes? So that you can actually, I guess, maybe not master your life, but I guess be a good steward of your life and the things that are happening in it.
I think asking those questions becomes important, because so often Christian sentiment comes across as Christian sentiment.
Yes.
Just put your hope in Jesus, and to ask in the appropriate place. What does that really mean? Like I remember, someone saying, like someone saying to me, you need to lay this down. Kind of lay this down. I was like, what does that even mean?
Ray's just on the floor, like in the church.
Exactly. You're just kind of like, I was much younger, but you're like, I know what you mean, but I have no idea what you mean. And so trying to find those appropriate places to ask. Because there's a time and a place. You don't want to question every time anyone says, just put your hope in Jesus. What do you mean by that? But with a group of trusted people to say, okay, look I've been really challenged. What does it mean? Like, not to be a pain about it, but just to try to get some clarity.
Genuine inquiry. And I think, as both of you were talking, I'm reminded that we're called to do this together. Like, we're called to be in the body. And I think sometimes, like, the church, Big C, because I think it's a universal problem, it's become a space where you wear your Sunday best, not just physically, but like personally, morally, characteristically, all of it. And so you come into this space and you stand up straight for however long your service goes for, and you give this projection of, I've got this, I'm just like one of you, when really that is the pivotal space and place for us to kind of go, man, like, Jesus, take the wheel, and can you guys help me out with that? Because I've got some questions. I'm feeling pretty hopeless right now, and I know Jesus is my hope, but I'm not feeling it. Like, someone, like, lend me a hand. Like, we're just not, well, I shouldn't project. I know that I'm not always willing to be real and raw with those questions that need to be asked in order to help me journey from sentiment into genuine expression of what I receive through Jesus.
It's the last place your heart's going to show up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let's do more real talk like this. I love it. Okay.
I'd hold your hand now.
But no, 1.5. Bless your heart. I appreciate the sentiment. Let's move on to question 3. So, Rita, as you know, as we looked through Hebrews 8, one of the things that the author really focused on is this new covenant, because the Israelites, they had their promises, they had their old covenant, and everything went belly up when they were disobedient and unfaithful. And a lot of language about the need for a new promise, new covenant that we receive through Jesus. And I guess, that's good. Like, and we're thankful for that. It's necessary, and Scripture talks a lot about what that new covenant looks like. But I guess you can't help, you find yourself in this comparison between the Israelites and the behaviors, I guess, that got them in that position. And when you look around our world, we see some similarities. We see, a world that has turned its back on God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we're in post-Christendom or post-Christendom or, wherever we are in our cultural context. But I think we can definitely say that God is not at the center of society's thoughts and perspectives and ideas around how we view the world. And so, if the Israelites found themselves, because they turned their back on God, in a situation where the covenant needed to be restored, what does that mean for us? And I've ultimately just reworded our third question. So I'll do the more eloquent version. If the Israelites' lack of faith resulted in a new covenant, what does that mean for the promises that we have received when we too live in a seemingly faithless world?
Right. I'd probably kind of have two responses. I think the first is that I think it is important to recognize that the covenant that the Lord made with Israel was not the covenant that was made with the nations. Right? Like, so it's the covenant for God's people.
Yeah.
And so that translates, I think, into the covenant that Jesus has made with those who place their faith in him. And so I think the question of what's going on in our wider culture is almost of a secondary nature.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, that's the space that we are called, as the unchanging purpose of God, right?
Yeah.
To be the display home, the living, breathing demonstration of what it looks like to live in relationship with God, that all might be drawn to him and receive the blessing of being in relationship with him. So I think that's a second question.
Yeah.
But I think the other part of it is, if the first covenant failed, will the second covenant fail?
Yeah.
That seems to me
it seems to be the heart of the question.
That's the heart of the question, because while we might look at the Israelites and go, geez, what were you thinking? We all know.
We're all an Israelite at heart, aren't we, at some point?
The differences between us and them doesn't seem to be particularly great.
Nope.
And to some degree, that's the point the author's making. There is very little difference between the lack of faith that the Israelites had and the lack of faith that we have, and the struggles that they had to distinguish themselves from their wider culture are the same that we have.
Yeah.
Even though it's no longer Baal and Asherah, it's money and popularity or whatever it might be. And the author's point is that what's changed is what God is doing in the relationship, right? So, again, we tend to have a very negative view of the Old Testament, but you look at the Old Testament and it's full of grace. God is the one who initiates. God is the one who starts. God is the one who forgives. And there are a couple of key places, particularly say the covenant is given at Mount Sinai, and then there's a golden calf incident while Moses is up the mountain receiving the instructions for the dwelling of God in the midst of the people.
A little bit awkward.
And God renews the covenant. And basically, nothing's changed with the Israelites. He hasn't, their hearts aren't changed. What we have is God's commitment to say, I'm going to make this work.
Yeah.
I will make this work. And then it's interesting that it's only after the golden calf incident that you get into the sacrificial legislation. Like, here are the symbolic things that are going to kind of point to the fact that I'm going to forgive, that I'm going to be gracious, that I'm going to continue to initiate. And what shifts in Jesus is that God kind of ups his game,
Yeah.
Because we can't. He's like, okay, well, you're no more faithful than you were. Your hearts are still wayward and wander all over the shop, and you can't stay focused for more than 5 seconds on what I'm asking you to do. So instead of making more laws or saying, that's it, I'm going to go find myself another group of people, he says, I'm going to change your heart.
Yeah.
I'm going to change your heart. I'm going to go to the source of the problem, and we're going to change your heart. And so again, the sentiment that we want to become real in our lives is that our hearts will be changed. And so the only reason the covenant in Jesus doesn't fail is because God is not going to let it fail. Which is the same reason why the first covenant didn't fail until God was like, okay, we got a new one coming. Right? Like, so God was not, it wasn't like God came up with Jesus because the first one failed and he's like, oh man, now what do I do? I need a solid plan B, and I didn't think this one through. Like, no, there was always going to be this time. And while we might wonder about the timing of that, that God's promise is, I'm going to make this work. I will be your God and you will be my people. And, come hell or high water, it's going to happen. And if I have to send my Holy Spirit into all of you and change your hearts by divine supernatural power to make this thing work, I'm going to do it. If I need to walk with you every moment of every day and be closer than your next breath, and so that the presence of Jesus is with you all the time, and if I need to give you an eternal forgiveness, I'm going to do it. If that's what it takes, I'm going to make it work. So will the second covenant fail like the first one did? Only if God fails.
Which we believe cannot happen.
It is impossible, the author says, for God to tell a lie. So
that's such a helpful way to look at the covenant, because I've got to admit, and I've had this thought myself many times, like, okay, so the first one failed, but that was God's plan. So can God's plans fail? But even it's not that the new covenant was because the old failed. It was just that and I guess this is that whole idea of the unchanging purpose of God, is that he upgraded. Like he just, he went 2.0 on us all, and the Holy Spirit came down and changed everything. Jesus came and changed everything. So, and I think even that just, such a simple change in the way that I view, I guess, the story of the Bible as a whole, that whole narrative is helpful.
Yeah. The whole Bible is God's story of being committed to humanity. And the only thing that really changes is the depth and level of God's commitment to that.
And
it doesn't change for the worse. It just deepens.
That's right.
And maybe it's our awareness of it that changes. Like you talk about being post-Christendom. Part of me actually questions, was God ever in the center? I feel because there's been so many heinous crimes committed on people, often in the name of God, during those times. So I wonder if we're just as faithless as ever, but God is continually as faithful as ever. And it's just really our, human reaction to that across the ages that shifts and changes. I mean, how many times do we look back on history and go, oh, we got that wrong.
My bad.
Yeah. So,
and if anything, not that there's any one silver bullet, for lack of a better term, but
can't we find another term?
We need a new one.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry. But you almost think that misuse of the name of God has even taken God even further out of the center of
the perceived center, the illusion of certainty.
Well, but this comes in that first part of the question, which is about what's the relationship between the people of faith and their wider community, right? Which is a much, much more complicated question. It comes back to that theological competence, cultural awareness, ability to act, and how those things interact with each other.
Well, we won't get into that today.
I think we've covered it enough. How about not?
Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. Great stuff. Have loved hearing your reflections.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, if you want to join the conversation, make sure that you log in to our online services this Sunday at gbconline.org.au and that you snap the Slido QR code before the sermon to get involved. Just a reminder for those of you who are listening to our podcast today, we now film the Big Three, and that goes to air on Wednesday nights at 7 p.m. at GBC Online. If you've enjoyed the Big Three today, be sure to give us a star rating and subscribe so that you can stay up to date with all future episodes. Thanks for joining us for this week's Big Three and our deep dive into God's invitation for us all. Remember, there's no thought too small, no question too big.